We've probably all seen videos like this before.
We must begin the work of dismantling the whole system of oppression wherever we find it.
We are coming to dismantle this deeply oppressive, racist, sexist, violent, utterly bankrupt system of capitalism.
I'm an Afro-Indigenous, non-binary local organizer here in Portland, organizing for the abolition of not just the militarized police state, but also the United States as we know it.
And heard words like diversity, racism, equity, white fragility, white privilege tossed around. Have you ever wondered why it seems like those on the woke left are reading from the same script? That's because they are. And do you ever feel, when they're saying those words, that they're using a different definition than the one that we're accustomed to? That's because they are. So what's happening here? Why does it feel like the word racist is being carelessly tossed around to the point where it's lost all meaning? Why is it not okay to simply be not racist anymore? You must instead be anti-racist. The agenda stems from a certain segment of postmodern academia called critical theory. Social justice studies, gender studies, queer studies, intersectionality, post-colonial studies, and critical race theory, all generally referred to as wokeness in slang, are all offshoots and maturation of what radical critical theorists have called the long march through the institutions, coined by communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci in the 1920s. In other words, a systemic takeover of our schools, workplaces, and governments, infusing a leftist ideology into said institutions. Critical theory is a worldview that has only become dominant in the universities over the last 2 or 3 decades, really gaining steam post-2005. It seeks to overturn basic Enlightenment values of reason, objectivity, and individualism, and instead view history through the lens of power dynamics. Communist philosopher Karl Marx saw history as a series of class struggles. Critical theory builds on that idea, arguing that the driving force behind historical progress is oppression of the weak by the powerful, and that all major Western institutions are built upon oppression of minorities and therefore must be razed to the ground and rebuilt from scratch. So what does this have to do with language? In order to support their worldview, critical theorists needed new words, or at least new meanings for old words. Part of overturning our assumptions about society means changing old, outmoded definitions to fit the new paradigm. Critical theory manipulates the language we use so that we sign up for what it's selling while we think we're buying something else. In other words, like the organization Black Lives Matter, we're being sold an idea encased in reasonable sounding language of human rights and equality. But in reality, we are buying a radical anti-capitalist ideology without knowing it. You needn't go any further than reading BLM's mission statement to find this. The most obvious example is the word racism. To almost every English speaker, racism has always meant prejudice or discrimination toward individuals based on their race. A racist is someone who disregards your individuality and only sees you as a member of a group. But under critical theory, this definition of racism is insufficient. If race relations are to be understood in terms of group power dynamics, under critical theory, racism isn't an opinion held by an individual. It's a system in which one group is kept down by another group. If we assume that Black Americans are disadvantaged on average compared to white Americans, then every Black person is the victim of racism, and every white person is guilty of participating and benefiting from a racist system. It doesn't matter whether you hold any racial animosity or prejudice in your heart. That's irrelevant. All white people are invested in and collude with racism, says critical theorist and author Robin DiAngelo. DiAngelo argues that any white person who is reluctant to accept their inescapable racism is wrong, and that their white fragility binds them to their own racism. Racism, the critical theorists say, is power plus privilege, something only applicable to white people or the dominant group. Note that under this definition, it's impossible for a member of a racial minority to be a racist. It's no wonder this is confusing to most people. The white blue-collar worker living in West Virginia who's lost his job because the factory closed isn't particularly privileged compared to Oprah Winfrey. But according to critical theorists, to deny your guilt is just evidence of how guilty you really are. Critical theory's biggest success comes from playing on basic human decency. No one wants to be a racist. No one wants to be a fascist. And that makes it hard to disagree with a movement that insistently brands itself anti-racist and anti-fascist, even though in practice these terms have lost all meaning whatsoever. Formerly comprehensible words like tolerant, inclusive, hateful, and even violence have taken on new and ideologically charged meanings. We are told that speech is violence, then we are told that silence is violence. we are told that asking perfectly sensible questions about human biology is hateful bigotry. These labels end, rather than begin, nuanced conversations and render definitions meaningless. These definitions are not only confusing, but they're also dangerous. They're explicitly designed to shut down dialogue and bully people into tacit agreement. They also reduce individuals to their group identities and judge them accordingly. This is ironically the exact opposite of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that we be judged based on the content of our character and not the color of our skin. Critical theory was once a small and arcane segment of academia, but the power and traction it's gaining can no longer be ignored. Merriam-Webster has agreed to adopt the critical theorist definition of racism, and while dictionaries don't dictate the language we use, they do lend legitimacy to these ideas as toxic as they are. George Orwell famously penned that controlling language is the first step to controlling thought. We not only lose the ability to communicate, we lose the ability to think. We must remember that critical theory is just that, a theory. It is never good for only one narrative to become dominant in the media, academia, and government, especially one that ironically silences criticism of that theory and open dialogue. For all the ways it needed amending, our country was based on radical ideas of equality and freedom, not oppression and power struggle. We've had flaws, discrimination, and bloody beginnings, and yet we work as individuals in a collective every day to be better. But we can only do that by seeing people as individuals, not merely as members of their race.